Zhuang, Night Thoughts of Zhangtai. Through the long night, a thither laments, strings pulsing with the grief of wind and rain. A solitary lamp, a distant bugle. The crescent moon sinks beyond the Zhangtai. Fragrant grasses are already withering, and still my friend has not arrived. No way now to send a letter home. Wild geese have gone and carried autumn south. So here we have the first of two poems by Wei Zhuang included in the anthology. So as usual, let's start with a brief biographic introduction of Wei Zhuang. Wei Zhuang is a pretty interesting figure. He could arguably be called the last great poet of the Tang dynasty. He lived in the last years of the dynasty. He was from the capital area, from Chang'an. Very late in passing the examinations. I think he passed them in about 890 something, when he was already 60 years old. And he witnessed first-handedly the collapse of the dynasty, and especially the destruction of the capital Chang'an by the rebel armies of Huang Chao. In fact, this sacking gave him inspiration for a quite unusual poem that he wrote in Chinese history, which is not included in this anthology. It's the Lament of the Lady of Qin, which is a long poem that is pretty explicit, at least for Chinese standards, and pretty gory in describing, at least obliquely, the rape, the burning, the pillage, the murder that took place in the capital during these days. There's a famous line in it that says something like, "Walking through the great avenues of the capital, one can't avoid stepping on the bones of high officers." Wei Zhuang himself would later come to renege of this poem. He didn't include it, or he gave instructions for it not to be included in the compilations of his poems, and it was only discovered in the 20th century by a chance discover in the peripheral city of Dunhuang, where many manuscripts from the Tang dynasty, contemporary manuscripts, were found. So Wei Zhuang, we said, very old, lived to see the collapse of the dynasty. Just before the fall, he had been sent to the area of Shu, the area where so many emperors and kings of the past had taken refuge. And there he served the military governor Wang Jian, who at the collapse of the dynasty proclaimed his own, the earlier Shu dynasty in the territory. And he was pretty lucky. He got appointed to very high office there, even though he didn't live many years after moving to Shu. And Wang Jian's court was a sort of refuge for scholar officials and poets at the end of the Tang, and its culture, its court, was the more continuistic with the old Tang Empire and its traditions. So Wei Zhuang, only two poems in this anthology. He wrote a considerable body of Shi poetry that has been preserved, I think about 300 poems, but he is not famous for those 300 poems. I think his Shi poetry is generally overlooked. He is very, very appreciated for his Zhu poetry, which was a new genre of which we've been talking about, not represented in this anthology. And he was, along with Wen Tingyun, the most important of the Tang poets who wrote in this genre. In fact, the four founding figures of the genre include those two from the Tang and two from the later period. And then that poem that we mentioned that was forgotten, the Lament of the Lady of Qin. Okay, so having given all of those pieces of background information, let's focus on the poem itself. It says, "Night Thoughts of Zhangtai." So Zhangtai was a tower, I think. I don't remember the exact translation of this word, which doesn't appear in this poem, but Tai is terrace, or tower. No, it is tower. So the high tower. And a note to this poem in this book says that this Zhangtai was a tower in which lovers were reputed to meet in the past, and then it became a euphemism for the pleasure quarters, for any place of prostitutes and entertainers. So the poem is Night Thoughts of Zhangtai. Night Thoughts already locates us in a subgenre that we've encountered many examples of, wakefulness at night. Those poems in which the poetic persona, whether a man or a woman, cannot sleep. He or she describes the sights and the sounds of night and their melancholy predisposition. And generally this sadness is apparently motivated by an absence. So there is also an absence, a distance, a traveling element to a lot of the Wakefulness at Night's poems. If not the poetic persona, the couple or the friend is far away and traveling in remote regions. And this poem fits the bill completely. And let's take a look at it couplet by couplet. The most unusual thing perhaps is that reference to Zhangtai, which I don't quite know how to interpret. Maybe adding to the poignancy or to the sadness or to the feelings of unsatisfied love at the moment or unsatisfied pleasure. But anyway, let's, as I said, take a look at the couplets. First couplet. Through the long night, a thither laments, strings pulsing with the grief of wind and rain. So the poem opens in media res, we could say. It's nighttime, it's a long night. Nights always feel long for those who are not able to sleep. And a thither is lamenting. We could imagine that the thither is being played by somebody, perhaps the poetic persona, perhaps somebody else in another nearby building. But the second line seems to point that those lamenting sounds are just the produce of the wind and rain blowing, strings pulsing with the grief of wind and rain. So probably there's a bit of wind and rain, and the strings of the thither resonate, and the sad melancholy predisposition of the hearer, probably the owner of the thither, make him feel that the strings are pulsating with grief. So that sound created by the wind and rain is a sad sound, a depressing sound, a melancholy sound. In fact, almost all the images in this poem are images of melancholia and sadness, melancholy. So, long night, sad sound, strumming from the strings of the thither. Second couplet. A solitary lamp, a distant bugle. The crescent moon sinks beyond the Zhangtai. So we get three images. Three images are juxtaposed, and they also contribute to the sad tenor, so to the sad tone of the poem. There's a solitary lamp. The adjective is very important. So this is a visual image. You might imagine that the poet, the poetic persona, is seeing far away in the middle of the night the twinkling of a solitary lamp somewhere, which means somebody is awake like him and unable to sleep. A distant bugle. In this case, this is an oral image. So there's the sound far away of a bugle, which is a sort of military trumpet. Perhaps this solitary bugle is evoking the possibility of warfare or of armed troops moving far, but not far enough. And finally, you have a visual image again, the crescent, but this is more dynamic than the static solitary lamp image. The crescent moon sinks beyond the Zhangtai. So the moon, the half disk of the moon, there's a crescent moon, it's sinking below the horizon and beyond the Zhangtai, beyond those pleasure quarters. The next couplet, this is the third couplet, or the first two couplets, you could say, are giving the background of the poem. We get the situation, it's nighttime, the poet is awake, but we really don't get any further detail. Now, the next two couplets are going to directly tell us the feelings of the poetic persona, which have been built up through this background of sadness, melancholy, and being alone at night. Although they still include elements of nature that resonate with the feelings of the poem. Third couplet, fragrant grasses are already withering, and still my friend has not arrived. So we might imagine the poem is set in autumn. There have been no clear indications of the season until now. Perhaps the wind and rain are more typical of the colder seasons of autumn and winter. And the moon is generally favored as an autumn image, but it's not an exclusive autumn image. So here, fragrant grasses are already withering. That would seem to point towards the end of the year. So it's been a long time since spring or summer. Now the grasses, the fragrant grasses, are withering, are dying away. And my friend has not arrived. Perhaps the friend was expected to arrive in, a couple of months. Now at least 3, 4, 5 have passed, and the friend is nowhere to be seen. We get no details about this friend. But we do get this feeling of loneliness emphasized and now made explicit in my friend should have come, time has passed, he's not here. In the last couplet, no way now to send a letter home. Wild geese have gone and carried autumn south. So the last couplet clearly points that autumn has started. We're probably at the beginning of autumn. And not only has the friend not come, but there is no way of communicating with the said friend. This is a bit rhetorical. I mean, I imagine the poetic persona could write a letter to the friend, but the concluding couplet uses a very regular conceit, which we've already encountered in some previous poems. It's the idea that geese are the ideal medium, the ideal carrier for messages. This comes from a Han legend that we've talked about before, in which a Chinese scholar and warrior who was a prisoner of the barbarians pretended to have sent a message to the emperor telling him of his plight by tying a little bit of a little letter onto the leg of a migrating goose. Now, geese migrate in China. They generally go, in autumn they go south, and in spring they go north. And this became a conventional poetic image of the possibility or impossibility of sending messages to a loved one. And says, now that it's autumn, no longer possible to send a letter. The geese have already gone south. And also, I like the concluding image. It's like the geese are bringing autumn with them. They're pulling autumn to the south. It's not just a cosmic seasonal event. It seems as if the geese, by their movements, were actually bringing the autumn season to the south of the country. So, not a bad poem, pretty conventional and specific, there is no specific detail about the poetic persona who is speaking, about the friend to whom the letter is sent, about any background circumstances. So it becomes, a pretty conventional, pretty topical take on the wakefulness at night and separated from a friend type of poem, but it's okay, it's nice.